Welcome to Out of the Fold. This episode is about Gary. He's an award-winning playwright and filmmaker, and in 2018 he released a book called The Gospel of Thomas the Younger. Links to his website and the book's listing on Amazon are in the description. No religious organizations, companies, or individuals were contacted for comments about any of the content of this episode. The views expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Saturday morning in late 2018. We recorded this episode shortly after I released the episode with the former Pentecostal who chose to stay anonymous.
I was raised in a fundamentalist family in the Bible Belt and grew up in a Disciples of Christ church. Now, that's a fairly liberal denomination in some parts of the country, but where I lived, it was a very fundamentalist kind of church. And in a family that prided itself on being founders of the church and very much integrated into the church. And so that things just weren't questioned much. That's the way things were. And we were, my brothers and sisters and I were marched into church and sat on the same pew every Sunday of our lives, basically. And not much changed until I got into my teens. And at about that time, I started realizing that our family wasn't a very happy family. And I think that made me, at some level, question what the purpose of all this was. Was I living a more fulfilled life by virtue of this life in the church? And at about that time, I met a kid in junior high school who became one of my best friends and is still today. And he set me on the road of questioning everything about the church and sort of led me into reading everything from Voltaire to Nietzsche, Camus, and Sartre, and things like that. And at a certain point, I started dropping away from the faith and rebelling against the family, which made me kind of a black sheep and was very troublesome for everybody in the family. But it was just a course that seemed to make sense to me. Nothing else made sense. But even as all of that was going on, and it continued for decades into my early adulthood, there was always something at the very base of me. I guess it was the programming or the brainwashing or whatever you want to call it, that sort of fundamentalist thing of, if you don't believe this, you're probably going to end up in hell. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of struggling with that all the time, that rationally I knew that what I had been programmed with was wrong. And also from during that time, I got interested in reading about Buddhism. And I studied Buddhism in high school and in college, and actually took courses in Eastern religions in college. But even though I sort of rationally agreed with the tenets of Buddhism, the practice of Buddhism requires renouncing desire at a level that my hormones just wouldn't allow me to do at that time. Not only, was I interested in romance and sex and those kinds of things, but I was very much attached to the idea of becoming a success in life and becoming a someone, and those things are antithetical to Buddhist practice. So even though I was interested in that and even felt like it was true on some levels, I just couldn't practice it. And at a certain point, I came out to Hollywood and had a career as a screenwriter and as a film director, and experienced that dichotomy of wanting success, striving for success, and knowing all the time that successful people around me weren't particularly happy. A lot of them were pretty miserable. And seeing that didn't really work, but still striving for it myself. And at a certain point, with a few things happening in my career, I hit a point where I just sort of said, enough of this. And I did start practicing Buddhism. And about 5 or 6 years into that, getting happier as a person all the time, I started reflecting back on the teachings of Jesus and seeing the similarities, moving aside the supernatural aspects of the Gospels and looking at some of the teachings of Jesus that were ethics-based and sort of philosophically based, and not so much the apocalyptic or, the salvation-oriented stuff. And I began to appreciate Jesus more that way. And that led me finally to do something I always wanted to do, which was write a novel. And the novel I wrote is a novel. It's basically a gospel, a purported gospel, written by a nephew of Jesus who actually sees the way it actually occurred in reality, that Jesus was a very human guy, but a very charismatic wisdom teacher who taught very much the same kinds of things that the Buddha taught, and who was very much interested in helping people to live happier and more fulfilled lives. But after he was executed, these Hellenized Jews that had grown up in different parts of the empire, like Stephen and Paul, who were very used to the idea of mystery cults, where a sort of demigod, a son of a god and a mortal, lives on Earth and performs acts and teaches in ways that help humanity. And they take Jesus' story and create a mystery cult around Jesus, and that is all sort of how that happens is depicted in my novel too. All of this in the interest of sort of showing people that maybe there's a different way of looking at Jesus and a different way of looking at Christianity than we generally have, both from the Christian side and from the humanist or atheist or agnostic side.
Would you say that you wrote that because that's how you believe it actually happened, or would you say that you wrote that for the purpose of kind of making people think about it a little bit more?
Both. But the odd thing about it is, and this is where it sounds a little crazy, everything I've ever written, and I've written quite a lot in my life as a working screenwriter over the years, everything I'd ever written I'd carefully planned out. I'd outlined pretty carefully. This, I didn't do that. I just sat down and started writing, and it was almost like automatic writing. It was coming right out of me in a non-conscious, non-planned sort of way. And it almost felt like a revelation. It felt like something that was moving through me, that I was channeling something. Now, of course, I don't believe in supernatural things, but I think that there are parts of us, deep parts of us that do surface at times, and that's what the muses are, so I do think that it is what I believe, because it came right out of, it was sort of, it was an assimilation of everything that I had read and studied and argued inside of myself for years and years and years, and had figured out, and it just sort of it was a story that told itself.
What did you want to have come from that? Like, did you want it to be something that was specific? Well, actually, I'm sorry. I guess when you're writing it, you're not really thinking about that kind of thing. But when it was done, did you sort of have a target audience for it? I know that you said kind of everybody, atheists, Buddhists, Christians, whoever it may be. But did you see it appealing to any specific group of people or type of person?
Well, I just hope that anybody that was sort of interested in these issues would read it. And also, I think it was very focused on being the very book that I wish that I had had when I was in my teens. If I had read this book when I was struggling with all of this and suffering under the burden of guilt about leaving the church and all of that, if I'd had this book then, I think it would have eased my way quite a bit. And I wanted to offer it to people that are struggling with these issues to kind of help them in a way, to not throw the baby out with the bathwater in a way.
Could you repeat the name of the book just in case?
Oh, the book is called The Gospel of Thomas the Younger.
Thomas the Younger.
And he's actually, the character is actually both a nephew of Jesus, because in the book, Jesus' sister marries my character's father. And he's also a nephew of Thomas, who is the brother of my character's father. So he has two uncles, Jesus and Thomas, but he's also named Thomas. You may know that Thomas simply means twin.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of people called people Thomas back then, but it was more a nickname actually, because they were usually, anybody called Thomas was usually a twin.
Mm-hmm. How old were you when you officially said, and I know that everything is gradual, but when you really did just, you were sitting down one day and you said, you know what, I have officially decided that I don't believe what I was taught?
Well, I think it was fairly early on. Again, there was an intellectual process that I stopped believing at around 15 years old, I think. Mm-hmm. But there was still this undercurrent, and to this day, there's this undercurrent of programming down there that that sort of agitates me a little bit about all of this.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that it took a long, long time to sort of assimilate that. And I went through various stages of the way I accommodated this belief. And, so that I ended up where I am now, I guess.
So what were some of the things that you read about from some of the philosophers that you were talking about that really stuck with you at that time? Because, I mean, if you're raised fundamentalist, it's not like somebody can just walk up to you and say, God's not real, and then, you suddenly don't believe anything anymore. So was there anything that you can remember that was like the first nail in the coffin or one of the first ones?
I'm trying to think back. That's a long, long time ago.
Or even anything that you think of now that, just, it doesn't have to be that specific thing, but something that, became like a mantra or something that still means a lot to you, that helped you to get to where you are.
Well, let me go back to your first question first. Okay. I think that there were things that I learned about the Bible itself, because so much of, I was in a fundamentalist church, which stresses sort of the inerrancy of the Bible and the perfection of the literal Word of God in the Bible. And as you start learning little things, like, for instance, the fact that, well, if Matthew says that Jesus was born in the days of King Herod, but Luke says that he was born when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, well, there's a 10-year difference in those 2 days. He couldn't. It's got to be one or the other. There's no way that those two. There's no period of time where those two overlap.
Right.
Or if Matthew quotes Isaiah and says that this prophecy predicts that a baby would be born of a virgin and would be this Messiah for this time, and that's Jesus. But then you actually go and look in Isaiah and read that verse and see that it doesn't have anything to do with a Messiah in the first century, but it has to do with some baby that's supposed to be born to solve some problem with the Assyrians centuries earlier. And that Matthew has said this, and he's getting away with it because back then no one had access to Isaiah. You had to be rich to own the scriptures yourself. It's not like everybody had a Bible on them. And these Gentile Christians couldn't read Hebrew anyway, and they wouldn't be admitted to the synagogues to look it up. Or maybe if they were rich enough, they could own what's called the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Jewish Bible. But so Matthew gets away with it for years and years and years until Gutenberg and the printing press gets invented, and by then it's just an established meme, that Jesus was born of a virgin, and it's predicted by Isaiah, and that nobody really looks it up. But things like that, just the many nails in the coffin of fundamentalism just started piling up one after another, and you can go on and on. Read Origin of the Species and start really realizing that, hey, evolution is a fact, and that there isn't this thing where all beasts are beasts and humans are humans and made in the image of God. No, we were once beasts. Our ancestors are fish. And all those kinds of things add up to where it just becomes more and more impossible to believe, except in the most symbolic, metaphorical kind of sense, which is not the fundamentalist sense at all.
Right. And when you say metaphorical, you mean taking the stories as parables and moral and ethical lessons in that way, but not necessarily literally.
Yeah. If you look at the creation story and just see it as a myth, that's trying to tell it to bring out certain truths about reality, but don't take it literally at all, and know that that isn't the way the universe was created. but it's just a sort of a story or a myth, to help people kind of get a grip on it. Primitive people that didn't really have access to science.
Right. So if you started to seriously lose your faith when you were 15 years old, but you had been involved with, the fundamentalist, side of Christianity up until that point, what were some of the things that you did while you were involved with that church? Like, was it really evangelical? Were you going out and trying to minister to people all the time? Was it more prayer focused? What was your life as a fundamentalist like at that time?
Well, I think that particular church, and this I'm talking now about the 60s. Mm-hmm. Evangelical, that whole evangelical movement really got moving about the time I left the church. But in my church, it was much more prayer focused and struggling with your own soul, Bible reading and Bible study, that kind of thing. In fact, in our church, sort of too much of a display of wearing your religion on your sleeve was kind of frowned upon. And the evangelical kind of thing was... and I think that in a way that's why those kinds of mainstream churches just started dying out. Mm-hmm. You either had to be fish or fowl. You had to, the evangelical churches really, really took off, and the mainstream churches that were just sort of the Rotary Club churches, like I grew up in, or kind of died out because they just didn't really have much of they didn't have much energy and heart in them.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like at some point it was like you were either 100% in or you were 100% out, and that sort of moderate side of it really was not as prominent at all anymore. I completely agree with that.
Well, don't get me wrong. I mean, I do think that the Christians in that church were 100% into it, but it was just sort of like not but it was a very personal thing. You know, it was based on everybody dealing with their own relationship with Jesus and with God, and not so much out there. You know, you're not obligated to go out there and convert all of others, although they did have revivals in the summer. They did have, you know, they did try to up their membership all the time, but there wasn't street preaching going on. And anything that smacked of, you know, speaking in tongues or snake handling or anything like that was just seen as, you know, trailer park stuff, you know, nothing that they'd be involved with at all.
Right. So what kind of things did they do to try to bring in more people?
Well, the revivals, Vacation Bible School, they had Boy Scout troops and Cub Scout troops and baseball teams leagues that played in the summer, so that you know, if kids wanted to play on a baseball team, they would have to come to church, and their parents would have to come to church in order for their kids to be, you know, play on the baseball team, things like that.
Mm-hmm. And you've referred to what you were taught as, to some degree, brainwashing while you were in it. How would you define brainwashing in this context?
Well, you know, I don't mean it to sound as pejorative as it sounds. I mean, it was just families raising their children with what they believed and what they fervently believed. Mm-hmm. And they really, and you know, as late as in my 20s or 30s, my parents were still sitting me down and asking me if I was saved, and worried about whether, you know, whether they were going to see me in heaven and stuff like that. And they, you know, this was stuff that they really believed, and it was natural for them to want their kids to believe that too, because that was their reality. But and the very fact that as a child your parents believe so passionately in all of this stuff makes it very has a profound effect on you. You know, I mean, there must be huge differences in people that, and I've known kids that, like, in their teens had come from non-church families who suddenly converted to Christianity and became heart and soul Christians. But they must be very, very different in psychology from someone like me that was raised in it, and it was like the air I breathed,
right,
you know, growing up. So suddenly, you're going to say to yourself, well, I'm not going to breathe that air anymore. I'm going to breathe this other kind of air. And it's totally different.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also a big difference between people that are atheists that were just raised in a secular household, and they've never believed or put a whole lot of importance on religion. Do you remember a time recently where you did have one of those things happen, that, you know, you were immediately brought back, even if it was just for a second, to something that you were taught when you were younger, and, you know, maybe it gave you like a you know, a burst of shame or guilt about something. That's usually what it's associated with me.
Well, yeah, I think you know, I'm of a certain age now, and I'm starting to think about my mortality, and whenever I have any kind of little health scare, you know, and start thinking about, hey, you know, I'm going to die, mm-hmm. There is that little pinprick of concern about that. But, you know, my rational mind is pretty much in control of myself. But there are just these little things that come up from the bottom of the subconscious or something that that programming is still sort of there, mm-hmm. in a way. And also, I have found that there are times where where I'll recite the Lord's Prayer, even though I don't really, believe it. I don't believe in a lot of the contents of it, and I don't believe in the efficacy of it. But somehow I feel like maybe by doing it, I'm sort of placating a bit of that sick part of my subconscious, or salving it some way so that things can calm down a little bit when I'm really upset. Of course, there was a time where I sort of rewrote the Lord's Prayer in my mind in a way that I could sort of understand it in a better way, or a way that made more sense to me. And I think that probably kind of plays into what I'm doing when I do that. I don't know if you're familiar with the books of John Shelby Spong.
I'm not.
Well, he was a Episcopal bishop, and he's written several books, kind of like Bart Ehrman writes books, one after the other about various aspects of sort of coming to grips with Christianity, and he's written one. He writes books about how to save Christianity from itself, which I think is one of those things that one of the projects we really have to do. It's embedded in our culture, and we need to save it from itself, because if it dies out completely, who knows what will we still have an ethical basis for society? Will we still value love and loving kindness and compassion, those things that were nested in the Christian culture? Will they go away too? Well, okay, all the really smart people that are humanists and think about these things, they'll have their ethical culture society. But for the common, for the masses, if they leave behind Christianity altogether, if we become a Trumpian society, where everything is about self-interest and narcissism, then God help us.
So, do you officially identify yourself as a Buddhist now?
I do. I've been practicing for 17 years. I'm a member of a group here in Santa Monica, California, that meets every Tuesday night, and been doing that for years, even on Christmas Day and New Year's Eve and whatever. We meet every Tuesday night.
What does
I meditate?
Yeah. So what does God mean to you now in the context of Buddhism? Is God something that you search for or wonder the nature of, or is it just a totally different concept from what God was when you were a Christian?
Well, fairly different. Buddhism just does not speak to the issue of theism at all. It just sort of says, it takes a pretty agnostic view and says, hey, what we're about is trying to make people reduce their suffering and become happier people. That's what we're about. Don't ask us about God and the afterlife and all of that. We're focused on that. But for myself personally, and this is kind of in my book as well, at a certain point, my character comes to an understanding of what he thinks God is. There's a scene where he's in Corinth as an older man, and people have sort of sussed out that he knew Paul at one point, and they're trying to get him to speak to the group. And he's been avoiding that all of this time because he doesn't want to get into argument with them about Jesus and about Paul, because he knows very well the story, and they don't. They just know what they've been told. But he gets up and addresses them, and he starts out with in the beginning, which is the first words of the Torah. But it's also the first words in the Gospel of John. And if you know the Gospel of John, it starts off, in the beginning was Logos, or we translate it as word generally, but the Greek word is logos. In the beginning was Logos, and Logos was God. Logos was with God, and Logos was God. And contemporary Christians, again, translate this as word, and they tend to identify the word as the Word of God, meaning the theology of Christianity, the fact that Jesus was born to save us and all of that. But anybody that really knows Greek philosophy at the time knows that logos meant something different. It meant divine order. Mm-hmm. It meant that there was sort of an underlying programming to the world that allows the world to exist. And now we call that the laws of physics, the laws of science, the laws of the biological laws that govern how DNA works and things like that. All of those scientific principles that allow things to be the way they are, the Higgs boson particle that allows matter to adhere and create the world that we have. That to me is what God is. Mm-hmm. It's that thing. It's not a personality. It's not something that throws thunderbolts or sends messiahs or intervenes in human affairs. It's the thing that keeps this universe or multiverse functioning, or allows it to function.
You probably know a little bit more about it than I do, but I believe Albert Einstein had a similar view to God as that.
Yeah, I think so. I haven't read deeply in Einstein. I'm not much of a science person, really, but that was my impression too.
Yeah, he believed that there wasn't any such thing as a personal God. So nothing that, like you said, intervenes, but definitely something that connects us all. Mm-hmm. Whether that's, us to each other or us to the rest of, molecules, air, trees, whatever it may be, that there is some sort of a unifying thing. But there isn't specifically something that's, up there and watching over us.
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm. Yeah. In Buddhism, we sort of stress the interconnection of all material phenomena, that everything is interdependent. I can't exist unless my parents, provide an egg and a seed to create me. Right. I can't exist unless there's oxygen for me to breathe and water for me to drink and food for me to eat. I can't exist if something outside of myself destroys me. But also every thought that I have can't exist unless there's a language in which it can be thought in that I didn't have anything to do with writing, or every image in my mind is a product of perceptions I've had, seeing things, hearing things, touching, smelling, and all of those things that I'm hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling are things outside of myself. So everything that I am is interdependent on everything else. And the classic mistake of humanity is to think that we are separate from everything else, that this skin creates some sort of border between us and everything else. That's an illusion. We all are part of everything that is. Part of the process of becoming enlightened is seeing that, or fully absorbing it.
Yeah, and I think that message can be really propagated a lot in Christianity, because so much of it is interpreted as being about not only the way that the universe or the earth was created, but how humans were created at the center of it. Which we pretty much know for sure by now is not accurate. Right. I don't know if it is chance or if it was something that natural selection over billions of years or whatever it may be. But even when I believed strongly, I can't say that I would look at animals and look at the way nature worked and thought humans are definitely the most important species here. There are fish that are below the surface, or below the surface of the water so far that if you brought machines down there, they would crack. And you want to say that those exist, but this whole existence is here for humans. Just those two things together do not make sense to me.
Right. Well, and the way things are looking now, it's almost it's looking probable to me that in a way humans were an evolutionary mistake, that we are destroying life on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole world would have been better if we hadn't evolved.
Going back a little bit, you said that when you were younger, and we were talking about brainwashing briefly and how they would, your parents would ask you, even in your 20s and 30s, about being saved. Now, when you say that you would fully renounce by the time that you were 15, or you were nearly at that point of saying that you didn't believe it anymore, would you tell your parents that? Would you lie and say, yes, I'm still saved, I still believe, or would you, tell them about what you were believing after that?
I would try to dodge the issue as much as possible, and I dodged the issue all the way through their lives. And in fact, I'll tell you that it went so far that even in my early 60s, when my parents were in their 80s, I had written this book, The Gospel of Thomas the Younger, but I didn't publish it while they were alive. Mm-hmm. I decided I'd just put it aside and waited for them both to pass away and then publish it, because I just knew it would hurt them too much. And so it's strange to think that I didn't have more. I don't know whether it was compassion and love for them, or if it was fear of their disapproval, or a combination of the two. But at any rate, I just dodged the issue as much as I could.
Right.
With them.
Yeah. Yeah. How did they officially take it when you told them, when you kind of came out as not being Christian anymore?
Well, I never really did that. What I did was just question them on various issues, and they always found that kind of maddening that they couldn't really answer the kinds of things that the points that I was bringing up, or they would resort to that. Oh, well, it's a mystery. God understands these things. We don't. We just have to have faith. That kind of thing. And I'd sort of leave it at that. But I didn't really. In fact, it was a very curious thing. I live in Santa Monica, California, or actually in Venice, which is very close to Santa Monica, a few blocks away from Santa Monica. Mm-hmm. And one of my best friends from high school days, who was one of my college roommates, who also came out here and became a screenwriter, and I've known forever. But he also had an interest in becoming a pastor, and he went to Princeton Theology Seminary, and he later went to Claremont, and at a certain point he was offered they offered him the pastorship of the Santa Monica Disciples of Christ Church, which was like 10 blocks from my house, And so it was a tiny, dying church. And so to be supportive of him, I decided to start going to this church of his and actually picking up some of the older ladies that couldn't drive anymore and driving them to church on Sunday. Mm-hmm. And, not believing it particularly, but just going through the motions.
Right.
And so that at a certain point when I told my parents about this, I didn't really tell them that, I wasn't believing any of this. They were just consoled by the fact that I was going back to church, that I was a member of a Disciples of Christ church again. So they sort of went to their death thinking, well, he's coming around. If he's not there yet, he's coming around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I'm not.
So if I'm doing my math correctly, if you're saying that you've been a Buddhist for about 17 years, and you renounced when you renounced Christianity around when you were 15, that would mean that's about again, only if I'm doing my math correctly, that's about 20 or 30 years of identifying some other way. So what were you doing in that time? I know that you said that when you did become a Buddhist, that like, you know, that you were kind of ready to, you know, not, I guess. So when you said that you first were thinking about Buddhism, it was sort of a negative to be pursuing being quote unquote someone. So was it just that in that time, that was when you were trying to build your career, and you weren't really thinking about religion very much?
That's exactly it. Yeah. You know, in my 20s, I had to have an operation in a hospital, and they gave me a form to fill out, and I had to check a box, and I checked Buddhist, you know, but I wasn't a practicing Buddhist. I mean, I identified as a Buddhist because that's what made sense to me, but that's really not the same. You're not, being a Buddhist is like being a Marxist. Unless you really practice it, you aren't really that thing. But I didn't realize that at the time. I just thought, you know, hey, if it makes sense to you, that's what you are. You know?
Right.
But really what I wasn't a Christian or a Buddhist either. I was a budding filmmaker, and that's what I wanted to be, and that's where I was putting all my attention. You know, Jesus says you can't serve two masters, and I really couldn't. I mean, that's the master of my career was what drove me all those years, and it took all the heartbreak and the frustrations of all of that to finally break me to the point where I said, okay, now is when I really need to, you know, trade in the master of this for the master of Buddhism. You know, I'm going to, you know, really get serious about practicing. And that's when my life really started improving.
So was there an event? Was there a thing that happened 17 years ago that I know I've already said this, but you know, everything kind of can be gradual, and it sounds like you always sort of liked the teachings of Buddhism and liked a lot of what you heard or read about it. But was there something that just, you know, at that time that you said, was it just that you kind of felt like you had accomplished everything you wanted to do?
No, it wasn't. There was something. I made a movie for a producer here in town. I made my living as a screenwriter, but occasionally, well, just very, very rarely, but occasionally, I would write a script and tell producers, look, I'm not selling this script. I'll only sell it if I can direct it. And a situation kind of like that, not exactly that situation, but another situation came up where I had a chance to direct a movie, and I directed it and under really pretty horrible conditions, in the sense that it was way under budgeted, and it was a total house of cards and a real struggle to get made. And then went into the editing room and edited the best version of the film I thought I could make, and then had the film taken away from me and recut by somebody else. And that was a very, very, very painful experience. And I really knew that the film was being harmed, and that it was going to harm my career to have it out in that form, and it was going to not be as good a film as I can make, and not going to represent me well. And those things just sort of crushed me, and I went into a really deep depression then. And you know, to the point where, you know, I actually started taking the Prozac kind of drugs and stuff like that. And I did that for about a year. And at a certain point, I just didn't feel like I was myself. I felt like these drugs were not, while they were showing me I could be different, I could feel a little differently, they weren't really, I wasn't me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time, I just happened upon a little advertisement for a group that was meeting in Santa Monica, a Buddhist group. And I said, I think I'll give that a try. And I went and from then, I dropped off the drugs and became, started really practicing from then, and felt like this was a really organic improvement in my mental state rather than one that was sort of chemically imposed.
Yeah.
One that was really based in my own experience and something that seemed very truthful, and something that, like, that this finally makes sense. I'm starting to see the world, reality as it really is, rather than some kind of nonsense.
Mm-hmm. So what do you guys do? Is it a lot of you? I know that you said you had meditation groups and things like that. Do you do anything else that's Christians do a lot of things like community service and things like that. Is there anything else involved in what you do for Buddhism?
Well, our group is basically a meditation group. We get together on Tuesday nights and meditate, but that's really to really practice Buddhism, one should have one's own meditation practice daily. Mm-hmm. But by having a weekly group session, it sort of keeps you. It's sort of like going to church on Sunday. It reminds you that that's what you're about. This is what you're pursuing and what you're putting your attention on. And the meditation itself helps you develop your ability to concentrate and focus.
Right.
But it also connects you with this sort of interdependence of everything, yourself and everything, that you're not the center of the universe, that you're just a part of it, and certain other, what we call dharma concepts, like impermanence, the fact that everything that's material arises out of something else, out of some other causes and conditions. And eventually, when those causes and conditions go away, it goes away. So everything is impermanent, including ourselves, including every thought we have, every feeling we have. Everything is impermanent. And nothing exists in and of itself. It's all, this interdependence is the rule of the universe.
Right.
So meditation on those things and trying to absorb that wisdom, not intellectually understanding it the way I just explained it to you, but like having it become so much a part of you that you don't see any real difference between yourself and anyone else. I mean, you are the same thing. You are interconnected. And so, of course, you're going to be loving, you're going to be loving and kind and compassionate to others because they are you. Because we are all connected. Mm-hmm. So we all have that practice going on in our lives all the time. The members of our group all have that practice going on all the time, and in individual acts of loving kindness and generosity in our lives. But we don't formally do. We don't do bake sales. We just sort of live our lives that way, but try to remain focused on that as a guiding light in our lives.
Gotcha. Do you consider Buddhism a religion, or is it more of a way of life or a thought method? I mean, what do you consider it?
I think you're right. I think the latter two. It is a sort of a thought pattern. It is a way of life. It's a practice. Mm-hmm. It's not. I don't think it's a religion in the sense that it requires faith in something that one can't see. The Buddha taught, don't believe anything that I say because I say it. Take it and test it for yourself like you would a coin to see if it's counterfeit. You test it yourself. And if you see that it's true in your own life, then go with it. But if you don't. And that's sort of the opposite of religion for me, which is all about faith in something that's been revealed to someone else, or maybe revealed to you, but not in any kind of way that you can verify. objectively.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because I was just thinking about this, and I've heard this, of course, with everybody that I've interviewed that came from any sort of Abrahamic religion when they were younger, that they were restricted from the things that were seen as contrary, or Harry Potter is seen as a demonic story to a lot of people. To me, that always seemed odd, even when I believed when I was younger. I always sort of felt as though if something is true, then you can listen to the contrary things to it, and it won't weaken it at all. So it always sort of struck me as odd. It always made the things that I was taught seem as though they were either untrue or that the people that were teaching them were insecure.
Yeah, well, they are. I think Christians and the most fundamentalist and most evangelical Christians are very insecure in the sense that they find anything that is challenging at all, even the most innocuous kinds of things. They find those things very challenging, and maybe it's because on some level they realize that at some deep level they realize that there's there's a lot to be questioned in what it is they believe.
Mm-hmm.
But their insecurity is a good word for it.
Yeah.
I remember various relatives of mine warning against yoga and meditation because those were sort of gateway drugs to the harder stuff of getting away from Christianity into the Eastern religions, things like that.
Gateway drugs. I never heard anybody refer to them as that, but I can see that as a metaphor that somebody would use. I have a theory that I'd like to ask you about, and it was something that I was thinking about after the interview that I just posted, and I asked my last guest. She was sort of speaking about, and she was raised Pentecostal, which is just what you were talking about with the holding snakes and things like that. That's what a lot of Pentecostals do. Not a lot, but it was a common practice at one point. It's a little bit more rare now. But you could tell that she was a little bit resentful towards what she was taught. So I asked her if there was an opportunity to outlaw something like Christianity, would you be somebody who would vote for that, for it to be outlawed? And her reaction, her answer was something that really made me think. She said that she wouldn't want to do that because she felt as though religion does have, and even Christianity has its place. It has value for when you're growing up. We create these things so that they can give us a purpose. And it immediately made me think of a Buddhist parable, the one about the raft. There's the traveler standing on one shore and he can see the other shore. So he builds a raft, and you probably know this a lot better than I do, and I'm butchering it, but he builds a raft on his side, and then he manages to get over the water to the other shore, and he's left with the decision about whether he should bring the raft with him or leave it there, and he decides to leave it because it served the purpose. And I thought about that in the context of religion, that I wouldn't be so connected to people who have left religion if it weren't for the fact that I was raised in it to begin with. I'm thankful for the fact that religion taught me to hope and wonder about things. I sort of took from it what felt right and what science and other things have taught me felt right, but I didn't take the things like being homophobic or not accepting Muslims, or anything like that. I took the stuff that really felt like it was good for society to accept, and then I let go of the rest of it. Do you have any sort of similar view to that although you don't believe in Christianity anymore, that there is value to these things, even though it is full of some things that are that people use to damage others?
Well, yeah, that's the big question, and I tend to side more with you. I've had discussions with my very old friend that was the one that led me away from the church back when I was 14, 15 years old, and he tends to think that religion and Christianity is basically they ought to be all prosecuted into the RICO statute. It's an ongoing criminal conspiracy. I don't hold that view. I think that it's very easy to quantify the evil that religion has done by just counting up the bodies, from the Inquisition and the Crusades and the religious wars and all the way down to what the Christian right has done to, marginalize people and things like that. It's very easy to quantify that. But what's very difficult to quantify is all the acts of love and self-sacrifice and generosity that have been done over the years as a result of Christianity. Those things just don't get counted up, and there's no way to quantify the fact that people are made more, that they are more, that their humanity is even though they're not humanistic in the sense that you and I know the term humanistic, their humanity is enhanced by the fact that they have been concerned with what Jesus taught, for instance, or what is taught in the other religions about compassion and generosity.
Yeah.
And I think a world without that would be a world where, I don't know, economic concerns would rule everything, everybody would be out for themselves alone, and I don't think that's a good world.
Yeah.
In fact, I think we've gone way too far in that direction as it is,
right.
with modern Christianity as a sort of handmaid to that thinking. Our Christianity has really been very well adapted to capitalism, and that's not a good thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and to echo something that you mentioned earlier, or just a couple of seconds ago, but give me a kind Christian over an angry atheist any day of the week. Give me a Christian who's working in a food bank and has a great sense of humor over somebody who doesn't believe and screams at people all the time. Absolutely any day. And it sounds like from what you were just talking about that you did. When you even after you stopped believing, you went back and you read aspects of the Bible and you saw some real value in a lot of what Jesus said. So even if you just take it as mythology or as parable or some sort of metaphorical lesson, that there is value in it as long as you do just see it in that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also I suspect that there's something else going on, that there's a truth there that we can't quite see. It's sort of like we're sitting in an auditorium watching a play, and the play is the Gospels. And there's a Jesus figure being acted out on stage, and sometimes he says things that the real Jesus said, and sometimes he says things that Jesus never said.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally, the real Jesus sort of pokes his head out from behind the curtain and looks at us, and we look at him, but only briefly. And what my book was trying to get at was to try to bring that Jesus out in the front, and sort of say, okay, you've seen this play, you've read this play over and over and over again, but that's just a play. That's not really what happened. Here's what really happened.
Mm-hmm.
And if I felt like if I could do that and do it convincingly and show base things in my book on things that I believe actually did happen, or the way things, some things that Jesus actually said, or maybe said just slightly differently, but but said, in essence, as opposed to the things that he would have never said, because a Jew in Palestine at that time would have never said those things, because it would have been blasphemy. They just would not have said these things.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody that had grown up in Tarsus maybe would say those things, or somebody that had grown up in Corinth or Rome would say these things. But those things have been put into the mouth of Jesus by the followers of Paul who wrote the gospel, long after Paul had done a number on them. The Gospels were written after Paul had written his letters to the church and had created his theology. So the victors, in a way, write the history.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've tried to do is go back and show what it might be like if the ones who really knew Jesus could tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, when you were still part of the fundamentalist side of Christianity, would you say that you ever really did believe it incredibly strongly, like you fully had your heart into it? Or would you say that you were kind of so young that it was that you were kind of just doing what you were told at the time?
Well, I think there was a time when when I was maybe 11, 12, and 13, where I really thought that I was headed toward becoming a pastor
mm-hmm.
myself. That's where I would end up. And I really did believe it, and I really did take the Bible studies very, very seriously. And it's ironic that it was all of that Bible study that proved to be the foundation for everything that I would, for both my critique of the Bible later on, but also my ability to kind of tell the story I wanted to tell, because I knew the Bible pretty well. For instance, if you take a story like the Transfiguration, well, you have what's there in the Bible, and you can read that. But maybe maybe the real story is different, and maybe the fact that you've got to have something like I had to have something like the Transfiguration in my story.
Mm-hmm.
But what it was a couple of guys, having a guy having a dream when they were climbing up a mountain, and what that dream consisted of, and things
right.
like that.
Hmm.
For instance, not many people know that in the book of Matthew, when the story of when Barabbas comes into the picture,
mm-hmm.
In some translations, you'll still find Barabbas called Jesus Barabbas. Now, in a lot of translations, they leave out the Jesus because they think you'll just get confused,
right.
if they put that in there. So they just drop that out. But in fact, the character's name was Jesus Barabbas, and I used that fact as the springboard for a telling of the way Jesus was actually arrested and why he was arrested and convicted. He was arrested, in fact, in my book, as in a case of mistaken identity. They thought they were going after this insurrectionist, and someone told them, some Judas character told them that, hey, Jesus and his followers are out there in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Mm-hmm.
And the Romans tracked them down and arrested this Jesus and then just tortured this guy mercilessly, trying to find out where his cache of weapons were and who his followers were and things like that. But it was the wrong guy.
Hmm.
And so, when Jesus was put into the tomb, the followers of Jesus Barabbas said, hey, if we can manage to steal this body and get it out of there, then they won't be able to determine the fact that they got the wrong guy, and they'll be complacent, and Jesus Barabbas can escape harm and escape arrest because they'll think that they got the right guy.
Hmm.
Things like that are in my book.
So that's an interesting theory. So that it's that. Are you basically saying? And I apologize if I'm again butchering this or misinterpreting what you just said, but that that's sort of that's kind of your theory about the resurrection then?
Yeah. That obviously I don't believe that a corpse can get up and walk around and walk through the streets of Jerusalem all the way to Bethany without causing some disturbance after everybody knows he's been crucified.
Right.
You know, I mean, it seems like the Romans would have some reaction to that. No, I don't believe that. So there has to be some alternative explanation. Now, some people, you know, I read in these atheist circles that there's this whole meme going around that Jesus didn't exist at all. He just didn't exist, that he's a fictional character.
Right.
I don't believe that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I believe there's enough evidence in Josephus and some of the Roman classical writers to sort of bear witness to the fact that there was this guy that was crucified by the Romans that later people, you know, thought was the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just trying to make sense of that story in my book. And also the story of how somebody like Paul, with his own sort of twisted psychology, ends up, you know, becoming the main proselytizer for this mystery cult that he creates, and he and some other Hellenized Jews create.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot of either ex-Christians or just secular atheists, you know, people that were raised into secular households, talk about how the fact that the story of Jesus is very similar to a lot of stories of sort of hero demigod type characters like Horus is a big one that people will connect them to. So they'll say, well, you know, if that's fictional and we don't believe that, so why would we believe in Jesus? You know, I respect people and I respect people's, you know, views of things, and you know, but that to me, I mean, I'm willing to accept that Jesus was a real person and that maybe these stories all started with, you know, maybe Jesus was the first story about something like that, and this was a real person, and that everything else was inspired by, you know, this story of Jesus. It just maybe didn't happen in the way that it's exactly told, you know, literally in the Bible. And it makes sense when you're talking about how, you know, there were different people that assisted in different ways to create this full story and then sort of appropriated it all into this one person.
Yeah, I think that what happened was that Jesus was executed, and people, you know, the whole culture in Palestine at the time revolved around groups of people doing these little pilgrimages to Jerusalem to do their sacrifices at the temple. And so they were constantly, you know, going back and forth, and groups of people were traveling together, and they would meet at campsites along the way and sit and talk around the fires and tell these stories. And so stories about Jesus would be told and embellished, you know, as stories always are, as they're told around campfires over time. And embellished stories got to people who had a predilection for a certain kind of story that they had heard all over the empire, you know, whether it was, you know, Isis and Horus or Dionysus or whatever, you know. Mm-hmm. And so they started taking these embellished stories as fact, and resurrection as a fact. And then Paul came along with his sort of developed theology. You know, he developed a theology out of all of this, and wrote these letters to the church. You know, he was convicted enough in all of this that he went around proselytizing and made some converts. I mean, and you know, it's hard to believe that people would actually believe this stuff. But then even today, people believe the craziest things. You know, they convert to the craziest kinds of things, whether it's Mormonism or some kind of, you know, thing that believes that aliens are like sitting in spaceships on the other side of the moon, waiting for something that, you know, waiting for us to do something to trigger them coming down. Yeah. I mean, people believe the nuttiest things.
Big one now is flat Earth.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So
yeah.
what do you think the purpose was for Paul doing that, or to somebody for somebody making it all up? Like, do you think it was for some sort of personal profit?
Well, I don't know about profit, but I think that there is something deep. I think Paul was a very narcissistic character. I mean, when you read Paul's letters, I don't get the sense of somebody that's wise, like the way the Buddha was wise. I get the sense of somebody that rants, that feels insecure when he's challenged about things, that gets angry. He's a very human kind of guy, and he admits that he's a flawed guy. He says, I've got this thorn in my side, and he doesn't tell us what that thorn is, but he says, I do these things that I don't want to do, and we know that there's we know that this is a character in psychological turmoil, and I think that a person like that, and I can identify with this in a way. I mean, at the very base of somebody of anybody who wants to, evangelize about anything, is the need to, be looked up to and be accepted as some kind of leader, as some sort of, prophet or something. I think that that's what was going on with that. I don't know if it's maybe it's psychological profit or, but not necessarily from the money standpoint, but he definitely had a need to be the expert about Jesus, and he managed to create this church that, through just dumb luck, Constantine came along, and there were enough followers, and somehow Constantine found that useful, and to reunite a fractured Roman Empire, and it became, the religion of the empire. We're off to the races,
Yeah. So when you did believe it fully, when you were younger, especially when you were 11 or 12, and you were considering becoming a pastor, then versus now, how have your views changed on things like sex, things like abortion, some of the more socio-political issues like, gay marriage, and, I guess, you could probably throw things like, marijuana in there if you really wanted to. How have you changed from when you really believed it? And, I know not every 11 or 12-year-old is thinking about things like that at that age, but, if you still were part of it to some degree, while you were still a young adult, what did you believe then? And how's that changed to where you are now?
Okay. Well, I would have to make a distinction here. Sex is one thing, and all the other things you mentioned would be something else. And that something else, I just have to admit the fact that I am so old now that when I was that young, things like gay marriage, things like abortion was illegal. I mean, we couldn't even conceive that abortion would be illegal, or that gay marriage would be illegal, or that these things would even be considered, a possibility in our lifetime. I mean, I would like to think that I was so liberal and wise back then that I would have seen, oh yeah, it's probably a good thing that people have choice when it comes to what they do with their bodies, and that people ought to be able to love who they love. But I lived in a different world back then.
That's fair.
And young people today can't even imagine, I think, what that world was like. But sex, on the other hand, was a very present reality in my life, and it was just, and that was the big thing. It was obviously the hormones are flooding through an adolescent's body and telling you to go out there and procreate as fast as you can, and yet this religion, on the other hand, is telling you, whoa, you can't do that. That is not for you, and it's really kind of odd because it's not even really the old religion, because now, in Jesus' time, you were a man when you were 13.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people got married very, very young. You know, the sexual energy was harnessed at a very early age. But by the time I was growing up, it was more like, no, you don't get married until you've graduated from college and you have a good job so you can support a wife, and then you get married. But by then, you know, you for 10 years, your hormones have been raging out of control.
Right.
And that just didn't work. You know, there was no way for that circle to be squared. And even today, you know, there are all kinds of evangelical people that on the one hand believe what they believe and say what they believe, but on the other hand are living very different private lives from what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
Because they just can't. They're just not built that way.
Right. Right. Yeah. My wife is Jewish, or was raised Jewish. She doesn't really identify. She's non-practicing at this point. But yeah, she was. I met an old rabbi of hers at a funeral a couple of almost a year ago, and the rabbi was joking with us about some of the more Hasidic members of the temple that were, you know, trying to atone or trying to do something good, and they and the rabbi just had to laugh because he knew the truth about what was happening in their communities. You know, he knew that there were affairs, you know, every other week. It's like the more restricted you are, the more likely it is to come out in sometimes really awful ways.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, there's always been hypocrisy in every religion,
Mm-hmm.
but in a way, the way we've sort of the modern religion of today, balancing the needs of what parents think children ought to be,
Mm-hmm.
you know, has made it a lot worse, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's just not. It's running counter to the natural world.
Well, I mean, it damages so much. Also, I mean, I don't. When I think about the way that sex education is taught, you know, today, even, I mean, it's there's very little sex education that doesn't have an undertone of fear, shame, and guilt. And whether that's associated with religion or not, and it oftentimes is. You know, we have fewer states in this country that require sex ed than we have that don't require. Sorry, we have more states in this country that don't require sex ed than that do, and the ones that do oftentimes are still not even required to have it be correct information. And so, you know, people are taught these really ultimately kind of terrifying things. Yeah, I mean, there are people that feel completely worthless, because they've had premarital sex. And it's, you know, my heart goes out to them. It really does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of damage that goes on with all of that, for sure.
So what were your political views when you were younger, and how have they changed as your faith has changed?
Well, I was raised in a rock bed Republican family in the most Republican of cities, Dallas, Texas. And I went along with that until about the time that I started following one from the church too, and that coincided with the civil rights movement and things like that, and although all of which made a big impression on me, and and also that drove me further away from the church, because there were all these, you know, basically white supremacist types of people in the church that I belonged to that did not, even though the disciples of Christ nationally supported Martin Luther King, that certainly wasn't the attitude in my church. And the dichotomy of that, or this sort of was another, nail in the coffin of my belief system back then. If these people couldn't be, really Christian to people of other races, then they weren't really Christian at all, in my view, or that this religion really didn't, I shouldn't be bound by this.
Special thanks to Gary for the creativity that he puts into his work. He and I spoke for a while after he told his story, and he got me thinking about some of the paradoxes in my own history with religion. There's no weekly episode this weekend with Faye. I have a family event, so make sure to tune in again in 2 weeks. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a written review with 5 stars. The written reviews help to move the show up the charts. For immediate updates and discussions, follow the show on Twitter at OutFoldPodcast. I started a Patreon and GoFundMe, located at Patreon and GoFundMe.com/OutOfTheFold. If you're listening right now, I'm not asking you to donate. Rather, just keep doing what you're doing and share the show with someone you trust. Logo and artwork by my wife. Production by my wife and I. All music by me. See you on the internet. This has been Out of the Fold.